class. Today we're going to talk about the Vietnam War, which is going to be a proxy war that happens during the Cold War. So we're going to be fighting against communism yet again because we're going to follow this policy that was started after World War II called containment, right, which started with the Truman Doctrine. But the idea of containment, the idea of keeping communism from spreading and kind of prevent that at all costs, even if that means getting full involvement or an intervention within the conflicts around the world. So we've already seen that in one scenario, the United States went in and stopped the spread of communism in Korea, right? So now we see a North and a South Korea. The North Koreans, communist, South Korea, democratic, supported by the United States. Um, and we're going to have to continue this policy because of this idea called the domino theory. So the domino theory starts up in the belief that as one country falls to communism, so let's say China, right? China being the largest country in East Asia and Southeast Asia. And so when China falls to communism, we look at this and go, uh-oh, this could be bad. But then we see that right next to China, you have Korea. And Korea then starts to go towards communism, right? So we go in there and we prevent that. Then we notice that another communist regime pops up in Vietnam. And so this supports the idea of the domino theory that nations that are next to each other will eventually be affected and turn towards communism. So we need to stop that and prevent that as quickly as possible, right? So this leads to the idea of the Vietnam War. So in order to understand the Vietnam War, you have to break it into two separate wars. So the first Indochina War is going to be where the communist regime tries to overthrow the French or the French colonial government that is established in Vietnam. So the French actually had Vietnam as a colony. And so this was kind of a fight really for independence, right? And after that, you see a breakup into two different sides. So once they achieve independence, you have North Vietnam and you have South Vietnam, and the French are no longer in the scenario. So the North Vietnamese are going to be led by Ho Chi Minh, which is going to be the communist government. And in South Vietnam, this is a non-communist government run by, and I might butcher the name here, but No Din Dem. I'm trying my best there. So, beginning in 1950, you see the next Indochina War that happens. There's a second Indochina War, which is actually between the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese. And so you see this, you see the North Vietnamese trying to push down into South Vietnam by force to turn the government into a full united Vietnam under a communist dictatorship. And so the North Vietnamese are going to be referred to as the Viet Minh, and there are supporters of communism that are residing in the South Vietnamese area, and these people are doing guerrilla war tactics. Those are called the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong are going to be fighting to try to overthrow the democratic government that is that is established in South Vietnam. So North Vietnam invades South Vietnam and tries to reunite the country under a communist government. The United States, playing a policy of containment, right? We say no, that can't happen, and so we are going to intervene with a small amount of troops in the very beginning and just saying, okay, we're going to come over and we're going to support the South Vietnamese. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese is going to be supported mainly by the Soviets and the Chinese. So, as South Vietnam begins to be overrun by the North Vietnamese coming in there, the United States sees fit to say, you know what, if we're going to support them, we're going to need to give them more troops. So, under JFK administration, he's going to actually push to escalate the war over there by bringing in more troops. So, he's going to jump the number up to about 16,000. Um, Now, when he's assassinated in 1963, his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, is going to take over. And when Lyndon B. Johnson takes over, he's going to re escalate Vietnam and actually bring the numbers to up to over 100,000 troops in Vietnam. Um, you have large scale fighting. This is the first time. There's a lot of firsts for the Vietnam War. One of the first is saying fully integrated forces, where you had African Americans, you had white Americans, you had Asian Americans, Mexican Americans. Everybody was fighting together in fully integrated forces. Um, you had fully automatic weapons. You had airstrikes. So a lot of like the technology has come, it's in full advanced at that point in time. And so the casualties are going to be extremely high during the Vietnam War, which is going to be very difficult for the public to handle at home. And also the media, like actually creating like films and being able to document a lot of the things that are going on over in Vietnam. Um, is going to also have a lot more advanced technology for that time period. And so the people back home are going to see a lot of the things that are going on in Vietnam. And so that's also going to create a public opinion that is not, in support of Vietnam. So what ends up happening because of that is you have a very divided America. If you look back at like World War I, World War II, the people across the board had a lot more support for the war. Even when you initiated a draft, people were in support of the cause. But when you look at Vietnam, it's a very different war because it's the first time really that America was divided in their support for the war. And you had the media, some of the media kind of putting things out there, which is creating people's bad opinions of the troops and of the war itself. And so you have a lot of protest, you have a lot of divide. Um, and so in the colleges, you see a lot of protesting over in the college areas. And a lot of this protest comes with the draft, right? Like a lot of people being drafted into the military, they're not volunteering to go over to Vietnam. And a lot of people argue that we had no purpose over in Vietnam. It's not our territory. We should just leave it alone. These are kind of the things that are being said at the time. And so you have on a lot of college campuses large protests of the war. One example of that is going to be the Kent State University protest, which is going to result in 4 students being killed by the National Guard that comes in to kind of like stop the protest or at least to regulate the protest. And this actually, the Kent State shooting is not actually a protest of the Vietnam War, but of a bombing that happened in Cambodia. But everybody kind of looks at that as it's all tied into the same thing, right? And so you also have 9 wounded, and of those wounded, some of those people actually ended up paralyzed. So this was a big deal, and again, covered by in every newspaper and like news program at the time is covering this, and so this makes it another bad reflection of the military, which people then start to become even more anti-Vietnam, anti-military. So, because a lot of things are going wrong with Johnson, like with people looking at Johnson, like, why are you re-escalating the war? Why are you making more troops over there? You're going to see a decline in public opinion of him. So he actually decides, you know what, I'm not going to actually seek re-election. So he doesn't try to get re-elected for a second time, and then instead Richard Nixon will be elected and will become the president, running on the platform of peace with honor. So one of the things he's going to promise is that, we're going to try our best to get out of the Vietnam War and try to bring some of our troops back home. And in order to do this, he sets up a policy called Vietnamization, which is kind of difficult to say, right? Vietnamization. So what the idea of Vietnamization is that eventually we will turn the war effort over to the Vietnamese people. So we'll train their troops, we'll get them prepared, we'll support them in every way, and little by little we will gradually pull out more and more troops. And so if you look at the graph down here, right, you see by the end of 1969 we have 480,000 troops over there. Then we're going to bring it down to 335, 157, to hopefully in the end in 1972 we're going to have 27,000 troops there. And so this is the idea, and it seems like a good plan at the time, but unfortunately it does not work, mainly because the Vietnamese, even though we trained them, we showed them how to do everything, they were not able to resist the invasions. I think knowing that the United States was leaving prompted the North Vietnamese to, up their ante, and supplied by the Soviets, right? They have tons of really good technology and everything, and they're just going to kind of sweep through and be able to take over. And so once we pull our troops out of there, the country is overrun by the North Vietnamese, and you will see in 1975 that the South Vietnamese will surrender, and it will be merged into one whole Vietnam, under a communist dictatorship. And that is part one, so refer to part two.